What's actually going on in the merger between JetBlue and Spirit Airlines? I know that large mergers between airlines in the US is not uncommon, but who is actually gaining from this one? Is it Spirit? Is it JetBlue? Or is there a possibility that it's a completely different airline that's going to gain the most from this deal? Stay tuned. Back in 2020, a lot of industry experts were predicting that we were going to see a lot of consolidation and mergers in the airline industry as a direct result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And indeed, a lot of the airlines all over the world and in the United States were suffering badly from the pandemic, but we didn't actually see that many mergers coming out of it. Of course, in the case of the airline industry in the United States, there had already been quite a lot of large mergers. Most of them happened after the crisis of 9/11. Some of them actually happened before that, most notably the one between American Airlines and TWA. But around 2012, 2013, the industry seemed to have stabilized around what we now call the Big Four: American Airlines, United, Southwest, and Delta. But it turns out that the mergers weren't quite finished yet, because in 2016, Alaska Airways acquired Virgin America. And what happened in that merger is actually going to be quite relevant to this story. Because what happened this February 2022 was that Spirit Airlines got into discussion with another low-cost carrier, Frontier. And that discussion about Frontier actually buying Spirit Airlines made a lot of sense in the industry, because these were two very similar type of airlines. They were both what we called ultra low-cost carriers. They had very similar fleets of Airbus A320s. And even though Frontier was actually on paper a little bit smaller than Spirit, they had more orders on their books. So they were going to become bigger. So the industry thought, yeah, that makes sense. Neither Spirit or Frontier started off as an ultra low-cost carrier, but they kind of developed that way over time. And both of them had quite similar networks with a high presence primarily in Florida, but also their networks varied enough for a merger to make sense, to have some good synergy effects. Now, very often when airlines try to merge with each other, it's a really messy affair, and that's because different unions might be involved, and it's always hard to try to merge different seniority lists and so on. But in the case of Spirit and Frontier, it looked like this might actually be a little bit smoother than normal, both in the way that both of these airlines kind of operated similarly, but also because managers had actually gone from one airline to the other, and the managerial structure was very similar. On top of that, they had also had similar investors over time. Right now, Frontier is owned by Indigo Partners, which is also owning Wizz Air in Europe, and Volaris in Mexico, and JetSmart in Argentina. All of those are low-cost carriers, but before Indigo Partners actually bought Frontier Airlines, they were a majority shareholder in Spirit Airlines. They hadn't been that since back in 2013, but as you can hear, it means that there is a lot of overlapping history between these two airlines, making it a probably fairly bump-free merger if it were to happen. But here is where things started to get a bit interesting, because in April of 2022, JetBlue came onto the scene and said that they would also like to buy Spirit Airlines. And they actually made a cash offer that was superior to the one that Frontier had offered for the airline. This caught everyone by surprise, because the JetBlue operation is very different than the operation in Spirit. Very early on in the history, about 20 years ago, JetBlue did market themselves as a low-cost alternative to the big airlines. They did so mainly by utilizing low-cost carrier strategies such as high fleet utilization, quick turnaround times, and so on. But that's pretty much where the comparisons stop, because after that, JetBlue has kind of walked in a way of becoming more of a premium brand, where they offer TV screens in the back of the seats, free Wi-Fi on board, and they even have less chairs than in the other operators. And this is what made the industry so surprised of the JetBlue bid, because if JetBlue would succeed in taking over Spirit, it would mean that not only would they need to rebrand the aircraft exteriors, they would have to change the interiors as well to get up to the JetBlue standard. And it would also change the entire cost structure of the entire network. And that's a big deal, because that would mean increasing ticket prices. And if JetBlue would increase the ticket prices, it's unlikely that they would be able to hold on to the existing Spirit customers. Now, there was an early theory that maybe JetBlue wanted to keep the Spirit branding, flying it separately like a low-cost subsidiary. That's something that's not unheard of. In Europe, it's quite common actually, where you have airlines like, for example, Lufthansa in Germany, which have their own low-cost subsidiary called Eurowings. But there has been no indication from the airline that this is what JetBlue actually intends to do. And of course, if they're not going to do that, it means that they also are going to have to increase the pay and the condition for key operational personnel like pilots, cabin crew, engineers and so on, increasing the cost base even further. So why did JetBlue get onto the playing field here? Is there something that we're all missing? Well, I'll tell you all about that after this very short message from my sponsor. The sponsor of this episode is Ground News, and that's a news platform that was developed by a former NASA engineer where you get the news as it happens, but they also compare those news with over 50,000 news sites from all over the globe and from different political spectrums, all in one place. Ground News is different than any other news platform that I've ever come across, and I'll give you a great example. So I was chilling back home just scrolling through the Ground News app when I came across the story about how JetBlue had sweetened their deal to buy Spirit Airlines to $3.8 billion, and that actually gave me the idea for this episode that we're watching right now. Now, as you can see, Ground News first provides you with an overview of the story, and then it gives you the 207 different news outlets that reported on that story. It shows you the political leaning, the bias distribution of the coverage, and potential blind spots. Now, I've been personally using this platform for months, and today I can give you, the viewers of Mentour Now, a special 15% off deal if you use the link in the description here below. So go to ground.news/mentornow where you can check it out for free, and then use this one-time offer to support a small group of media outsiders who are trying to make the news more transparent for all of us. Now back to the video. In order to understand JetBlue's actions, we need to look into a couple of more factors as well, and one of those are regulatory requirements. Now, regulatory requirements would definitely have played a role in the merger between Spirit and Frontier as well, and that's because we're no longer in the post-9/11 era. The US authorities are much more skeptical of both mergers and even close alliances between airlines nowadays, and that's because they're sensitive to anti-competitive behavior. For example, if we look at a merger between Spirit and Frontier, they would have had to show to the US regulators that if they merged, the prices of the ultra-low fare tickets wouldn't come up as a result. JetBlue has already previously seen some resistance from the regulators when they tried to do an alliance with American Airlines in the American Northeast, called the Northeast Alliance, and to some, this just adds another problem in the pot for JetBlue buying Spirit. But of course, JetBlue is arguing that it would have been a much bigger regulatory problem in a merger between Frontier and Spirit to ultra low-cost carriers, where the risk of them merging would lead to higher tickets prices, but that hasn't really convinced all of the analysts yet. But what is it that makes Spirit such an attractive acquisition for JetBlue then? Well, this has to do with Spirit's bases, its network, and at the very end, its slots at major airports. Remember how I told you that Alaskan Airlines ended up buying Virgin America? Well, the other airline who wanted to buy Virgin America was JetBlue. JetBlue and Virgin America would have been a really good match since they were both Airbus A320 operators, aside from JetBlue's Embraer 190s. They both had a lower cost base than the Big Fours and quick turnaround, and if JetBlue would have been able to buy Virgin America, it would have acquired a very similar type of operation, but with a large West Coast presence in the United States. JetBlue started off with a predominantly East Coast operation and has been trying to work its way towards the West Coast ever since. So it seems very likely that after having missed the opportunity to buy Virgin America, JetBlue has been on the hunt for another company to acquire that could expand its bases and, crucially, its availability of slots on the West Coast. And that's likely why they started hunting after Spirit, even though the Spirit operation is nowhere as close to its operation as Virgin America was. But from the very beginning, JetBlue's negotiations with Spirit Airlines has not gone very well. As soon as the bid was known publicly, JetBlue's shares started plummeting, and it turns out that JetBlue actually wanted to keep the negotiations secret, but a leak from within the company made them having to go out publicly, and before they could explain what this was all about, their share price had already fallen substantially. And the reason that the stock price was plummeting the way it did was that the bid that JetBlue had given for Spirit had completely eclipsed the bid that Frontier had made. This then turned into a bidding war, with each side increasing its bid, but Frontier never went over the bid of JetBlue. Now, the reason behind that was likely because Frontier thought that they had a better regulatory chance to get their merger approved than what JetBlue had. JetBlue countered that sentiment by offering a so-called reverse breakup fee to the shareholders of Spirit Airlines. What that meant was they basically told them that, okay, if we agree on a price and then the regulators come in and say that we can't do the merger, we will pay you $400 million to account for any damage that you might have gotten. And that, of course, forced Frontier to come in and offer a similar reverse breakup fee after that. In any case, a merger between any of these airlines would have created the fifth biggest airline in the United States behind the big four, but the difference being that if Frontier and Spirit would come together, it would create an enormous low-cost carrier. But if JetBlue takes over Spirit, it would create another airline that would probably just target the market of the big four. Now, as this bidding war was going on, some controversy was going into the discussion as well. And that's because initially some independent analysts had said that they preferred the Frontier bid rather than the JetBlue bid, even if it was smaller. And that likely had to do with the likelihood of getting approval from the authorities. But when JetBlue came back and offered its reversed breakup fee, those analysts changed their minds. But for some reason, the board of Spirit kept postponing the vote about which of these two bids they were going to accept for a long time. This looked like clear favoritism from the board members of Spirit Airlines towards Frontier, and it really frustrated JetBlue, who pointed out that there were some personal links between board members in both companies. Whether or not that actually had an impact on why this took so long, we will never really know. But what we do know is that the vote for which bid to take was postponed 4 times. Then, in the end of July 2022, Spirit Airlines finally announced that they were accepting the takeover bid from JetBlue. Frontier had said that they were not going to increase their final bid, which was set at $2.7 billion, and JetBlue had offered $3.8 billion, meaning a 38% premium on the share price of Spirit Airlines. So is this all over now then? No, far from it. This deal is going to take to at least 2024 to go all the way through, and prior to that, JetBlue is going to have to get the blessing from all of the involved regulators, and that's not a small task. And apart from that, we have to ask ourselves the question, who is actually the winner here? Is it JetBlue? Is it Spirit Airlines? Well, according to the excellent publication The Air Current, which I invite all of you to check out, the answer to that question is actually Frontier. The rationale behind that argument is pretty straightforward. Remember that this all started with Frontier wanting to buy Spirit Airlines. The reason they wanted to buy Spirit was because they saw some synergy effects where they could go in and they could create a big, healthy, national, low-cost carrier. That airline would have been so big that it would have been able to take on any of the upstart low-cost carriers that was coming, and even Southwest Airlines. But what now happened instead was that JetBlue came out from nowhere, snapped up Frontier's biggest competitor, and is basically turning it into a regular airline instead of an ultra low-cost carrier. Meaning that Frontier is now sitting alone as the biggest ultra low-cost carriers in the United States. And with its biggest competitor gone, this paves the way for Frontier to completely take over the ultra low-cost market in the US. And on top of that, because Spirit backed out of the initial deal it had with Frontier back in February, Spirit now has to pay $25 million to Frontier for the damages. But of course, this also means that Frontier won't have access to as many planes, personnel and slots that it would need to do a rapid expansion. This is going to take a few years. But looking into the plans that Frontier has announced, they're looking at an expansion between 10 and 20% per year after 2024, which is when the merger takes place between JetBlue and Spirit. And Bill Franke, the owner of Indigo Partners, also said in an interview that he was very careful not to be dragged too far into a bidding war with JetBlue. And this is a strategy that obviously seemed to have paid off well, because the share price of Frontier has been bumped up a whopping 40% since the announcement. So, well played. What do you think about this? I'd love to hear your comments in the comment section below. Make sure you have subscribed to the channel. And now check out this video next. I think you can like that one, or this one. If you want to support the work that we do here on the channel, then consider becoming part of my lovely Patreon crew, or buy yourself some merch. Have an absolutely fantastic day, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.